Everyone thought the fines were just paper, a slip tucked under the windshield, a letter slipped into the mailbox, a few $100s for the wrong shade of paint, another couple hundred for leaving a trash bin out too long. Small, ordinary punishments that most people shrugged off until they added up to thousands. But behind every fine was a story, and behind every story was someone quietly breaking under the weight. That's why when the new California bill passed, the cheers didn't come from politicians. They came from neighborhoods, from the tired families who'd been paying penalties just to live in their own homes, from the man who lost his garden because his flowers did fit the aesthetic, from the single mother who had to choose between paying her HOA fine or her son's tuition bill. The state had finally done something unthinkable, something homeowners never believed would happen. They had just crushed HOA fines. But it didn't start with the bill. It started with one man standing outside his garage, staring at a letter trembling in his hand. David Morales had lived in his small California suburb for 12 years. He bought his home with his wife when their daughter was still in preschool. They thought the HOA would protect property values, keep things neat, keep the neighborhood safe. But over the years, what was meant to be protection turned into punishment. The letters began with warnings, then fines, then threats, and this paper in his hand was the worst yet. Violation, unauthorized modifications to driveway. His crime, repairing a crack with his own cement when the HOA refused to fix it. Fine amount, $2,500, due immediately. David laughed when he first read it. Then he stopped laughing when he realized they were serious. They had fined him 2 months' salary for fixing something himself. His neighbors told him to let it go. Some said just pay it, fight it later. Others said the HOA always wins. But David couldn't shake the feeling that if he let this stand, it wouldn't end. What he didn't know was that his letter wasn't just a letter. It was the beginning of a fight that would stretch all the way to Sacramento. Because behind closed doors, lawmakers had started noticing the same thing. A stack of complaints piling higher every month. Stories of families forced into foreclosure, not because they couldn't afford their mortgage, but because they couldn't keep up with HOA fines. But for now, David didn't know about bills or lawmakers or hearings. All he knew was the rage boiling in his chest as he crumpled that letter and threw it across the garage. "What do they want from me?" he whispered. "What else can they take?" That night he sat with his wife at the kitchen table, the bills spread out like a battlefield in front of them. The mortgage, utilities, gas, food, and now this. His wife reached across the table, her hand trembling. "David, we can't fight them. We'll lose everything." But David's eyes were hard. Then maybe it's time they lose something too. He didn't know it yet, but across the state, hundreds of other families were sitting at their kitchen tables, whispering the same words. Tired, angry, done being pushed around. And in a way, it was all of them together, the forgotten, the fined, the silenced, that forced California to listen. But that's the thing about change. It never comes clean, it never comes quick, and it never comes without a fight. Because the HOA wasn't going to let go of their power that easily. The morning after David threw that letter, the neighborhood looked exactly the same. The lawns were still manicured, the driveways spotless, the flags fluttered in neat rows. But for David, nothing felt the same. He watched the HOA president's car roll slowly down the street. A white SUV with tinted windows, always watching, always waiting. The driver didn't stop this time, but the message was clear. We're in control. David leaned against his garage door, arms crossed, heart pounding. He wasn't afraid of one man in a car. He was afraid of what that car represented, an entire system built to break people like him. And yet, something inside him refused to break. That night, he opened his laptop. He typed California HOA fines into the search bar. Article after article appeared. Families losing their homes over mailbox colors. Veterans fined for flying the wrong flag. A couple charged $300 a day because their grass was too native. It wasn't just him. For hours, David read. The more he read, the more the anger shifted into something else. A strange kind of energy, a fire. By midnight, he wasn't just a man with a fine. He was a man with proof. The next week, he called a meeting. Not at City Hall, not in some courtroom, but in his backyard. 5 neighbors came, then 10, then 20. They stood in folding chairs, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward the street like they were planning a crime. But what they were planning wasn't a crime, it was survival. "Look at this," David said, holding up a stack of printouts. "We're not the only ones, this is happening everywhere, and it's getting worse." A woman in the front row raised her hand. Her voice shook. "They threatened to take my house over a satellite dish. I've lived here 25 years. Another man stepped forward. "They fined my mother when she was in the hospital because she missed a yard inspection." The backyard fell silent. Everyone was thinking the same thing. If they could do this to one of them, they could do it to all of them. David's voice hardened. "We can't fight them one by one, but together, maybe we can make someone listen." That was the night the fight stopped being about one fine. It became about every fine. And while most of the neighborhood slipped back into silence the next morning, afraid of retaliation, afraid of being targeted, the seed had been planted. David started emailing, then calling, then writing. Local reporters ignored him. Council members brushed him off. Even lawyers warned him. HOAs always win. But still, he didn't stop. And then a reply, not from a reporter, not from a lawyer, from a legislative aide in Sacramento. "Mr. Morales, thank you for reaching out. We've received dozens of similar complaints. Would you be willing to testify?" David stared at the email. Testify. The word sounded foreign, like something out of a courtroom drama. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. He was just a father, a husband, a man with a driveway crack. But sometimes the smallest cracks open the biggest walls. He wrote back one word, "Yes." Weeks later, David sat in a government building under fluorescent lights. His palms sweaty, his throat dry. Around him were other homeowners, faces lined with exhaustion, eyes filled with quiet rage. They weren't neighbors, not really. Some were from Lowe's Angels, others from small desert towns. Different backgrounds, different stories, but all of them carried the same scars. When it was his turn, David stood. His voice shook at first, but then it grew stronger. "They fined me for fixing my own driveway. $2,500, that's not protection, that's theft." He held up the letter. The room went quiet. "They say HOAs protect our property values. But who protects us? Who protects families like mine when the people we trusted to keep our neighborhoods safe turn into debt collectors?" Silence again, then a murmur, then something else, a shift. Because in that moment, it wasn't just David's fight anymore. It was everyone's. The lawmakers didn't promise change that day. They didn't pass a bill on the spot, but they listened. And sometimes listening is the first crack in the wall. But back in his own neighborhood, the wall wasn't cracking. It was tightening. The next week, another letter appeared in his mailbox. This time, the violation was unsightly gatherings. Fine $500. They had seen the backyard meeting. They were watching. David crumpled the letter. He didn't even read the rest. His hands shook, but not from fear anymore. "They think this is over," he whispered. "They have no idea what's coming." Because what he didn't know, what no one in his neighborhood knew, was that in Sacramento, a quiet storm was already brewing. Lawmakers were drafting something new, a bill that could change everything. But storms never arrive without thunder. And the HOA, they were ready to fight back. The letter wasn't the end. It was the beginning of war. 2 days after David ignored the unsightly gatherings fine, his driveway was marked with orange paint. The kind city workers used to signal construction. Except this wasn't the city. This was the HOA. By noon, he had another notice taped to his door. "Driveway scheduled for inspection. Additional fines may apply." David tore it down, his hands trembling with fury. They weren't fixing anything. They were circling, tightening the noose, making sure he knew, no matter what Sacramento was whispering about, here in this neighborhood they were in charge. That night his wife found him sitting on the porch steps. The street was too quiet, the air too still. "They're going to ruin us," she whispered. "Can't you see? They'll find a way to take the house." David didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the streetlight flickering at the corner. "Maybe," he said finally, "but maybe they picked the wrong house this time." He didn't tell her about the calls he'd been getting, the whispers from other neighborhoods, people he didn't know leaving messages saying, "I saw you at the hearing. I thought I was alone. Thank you." It wasn't just his voice anymore. It was hundreds, and soon thousands. But voices don't stop the people in power. Power only respects pressure. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, not to fix problems, not to listen, to make an example of him. David walked into the clubhouse under buzzing fluorescent lights. The room smelled of old carpet and coffee. At the front, the board sat in a row like judges, their eyes cold, their smiles tighter than their ties. "Mr. Morales," the president said, his voice dripping with authority, "we've reviewed your violations. This community thrives on order, and you, sir, are disorder." The room was full. Neighbors whispered in the back, some sympathetic, some smug. David stood tall, though his stomach churned. "Order? You call this order? You fine a woman for planting roses. You threaten an old man for putting up a ramp for his wife. That's not order. That's bullying." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The president's jaw tightened. "This meeting is not for grandstanding. This is your final warning. Pay your fines or we'll proceed with a lien." The word hit like a punch. Lien. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. The first step toward foreclosure. David's hands clenched. His voice dropped low but steady. "You can put all the liens you want, but when the law changes, and it will, your little empire will crumble." The president smirked. "The law, Sacramento doesn't run this neighborhood, we do." And that was the problem. David walked out of the clubhouse to the sound of whispers and clicking pens. Some neighbors avoided his eyes. Others gave him nods so small they were almost invisible. Silent support, silent fear. But the story didn't stay silent. The next morning, a local blogger posted about the meeting. By evening, the story had spread. "California man faces foreclosure over driveway repair." Reporters started calling. Not many, not big ones, but enough. Enough to turn whispers into echoes. For the first time, the HOA wasn't just fighting David. They were fighting the spotlight. But spotlights make people dangerous. 3 days later, David woke to the sound of metal clanking outside. He pulled back the curtain. His blood ran cold. A tow truck. Hooking up his daughter's car. He ran outside, shouting. The driver handed him a slip. HOA order, unapproved vehicle modifications, tinted windows. His daughter, barely 18, stood barefoot in the driveway, tears streaming down her face. "Dad, they can't do this." But they could, they were. David stepped between the truck and the car, his chest heaving. "You're not taking it, not today." The driver shrugged. "Take it up with your board." The neighbors peeked through blinds, some filming, some just watching. The humiliation was the point. And in that moment, David almost broke, almost gave in. But then he saw his daughter's face, the fear in her eyes, the helplessness, and something hardened in him. "This ends now," he whispered. That night, he called the aide in Sacramento again. His voice didn't shake this time. "You want testimony, you want proof. I'll give you everything, but you need to act because they're not just fining us anymore, they're destroying families." The aide's voice was calm but urgent. "Mr. Morales, we're drafting a bill. It won't be easy. The lobby is strong, but your story could change everything." David sat in the dark kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, eyes burning. He didn't feel like a hero, he didn't feel strong. He felt tired, he felt scared. But sometimes, change doesn't come from heroes. It comes from ordinary people who finally decide enough is enough. And David had decided. The bill was coming. But the HOA wasn't done. Because when you threaten power, power fights back. The headline was small, buried on page 3 of the local paper. Neighborhood HOA threatens family with foreclosure over driveway crack. Most people would have skimmed past it. Just another story about rules, about fines, about a fight that seemed too small to matter. But for the ones who lived it, it wasn't small. It was everything. David unfolded the paper at the kitchen table. His wife leaned over his shoulder, her brow furrowed. "Page 3, she whispered. "That's all we are to them, page 3. David folded the paper slowly, his jaw tight. For now. Because he knew something the HOA didn't. The aide in Sacramento had called again. The bill was moving. Drafts were written. Committees were whispering. The tide was shifting. But tides rise slowly, and the HOA knew how to swim. That same week, neighbors started receiving letters too. Not just David. Anyone who had spoken up. Anyone who had nodded in his direction at the clubhouse meeting. Violation, improper lawn maintenance. Violation, unapproved window treatments. Violation, excessive street parking. It wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about fear. One by one, people stopped coming to David's backyard meetings. They stopped returning his calls. They waved less, looked away more. Isolation, that was the HOA's real weapon. And it worked for a while. Until one night when David's phone buzzed at midnight. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something in him said answer. A voice cracked through the line, a woman's voice shaking. "My husband, they're trying to take his truck. Please, I saw what they did to you. I don't know who else to call." Her address was across town. A different HOA, a different neighborhood, but the story was the same. David drove there before dawn. He found the tow truck parked in the cul-de-sac, chains rattling in the cold morning air. A man stood barefoot in the driveway, shouting, his wife sobbing behind him. The driver handed David a slip, the same script, the same excuse. Unapproved modifications. Tinted windows, custom tires, it didn't matter. The goal wasn't order, it was obedience. David stood shoulder to shoulder with the man. "Not today," he said quietly. The driver looked at them. Two men in the cold, tired but unshaken. He shook his head, unhooked the chains, and drove off. The wife grabbed David's hand, tears streaking her face. "They won't stop, you know that, don't you?" David nodded, "I know." By the time the sun rose, photos of the standoff were online. A neighbor had filmed everything. The clip spread faster than the article ever had. And suddenly, page 3 didn't matter anymore. By evening, David's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local stations, radio hosts, even national blogs. The story wasn't just about one driveway now. It was about a pattern, a system, a quiet war hidden in plain sight. And Sacramento, they noticed. The aide called again, this time with urgency. "Mr. Morales, we need you here, not next month now." David rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing heavy. "They're tearing us apart down here. You don't understand. They'll destroy us before you pass anything." There was a pause, then the aide's voice steady but firm. "Then we need to move faster." But speed was dangerous, because the faster the bill moved, the harder the pushback would hit. The HOA president wasn't smiling anymore. He called David in for a final review. The room was smaller this time. No rows of neighbors, just the board, 5 faces, cold, stern, rehearsed. "You're making this worse for everyone," the president said, voice sharp as glass. "The more attention you bring, the more scrutiny this neighborhood faces. Do you want your neighbors to hate you? Because that's where this is heading." David leaned forward, eyes burning. "You don't get it. They don't hate me. They're afraid of you. There's a difference." The president's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Afraid? They should be, because when Sacramento fails, and it will, you'll be left alone, and we'll still be here." David stood slowly. "Maybe, but even if Sacramento fails, people know now, and once people know, you can't make them unknow. You've already lost." The words echoed in the empty room, and for the first time the president's eyes flickered, just for a moment, a crack. But cracks don't topple walls on their own. They need pressure. And pressure was building. The following week, hearings began. The bill was introduced with language no one thought possible. No HOA shall impose excessive fines or penalties beyond a set limit per year. Foreclosure shall not be pursued for fines under $5,000. Homeowners shall retain the right to repair and maintain property without unreasonable interference. The chamber filled with murmurs. HOAs sent their lawyers. Lobbyists stormed the hallways. They called it government overreach. They called it chaos. But sitting in the back, David saw something else. Homeowners, ordinary people. Silent, tired, bruised by years of fines, their eyes locked on the podium. Because for the first time in a long time, someone was speaking for them. And as David prepared to testify again, he realized something. This wasn't about a driveway anymore. It wasn't even about fines. It was about dignity, about whether ordinary families had the right to live without fear in their own homes. And that fight was far from over. Everyone expected the hearing to be routine. A few testimonies, a few questions, and then months of paperwork. No one expected the storm. The chamber was packed. Homeowners filled the benches, their eyes tired but burning with hope. On the other side, lawyers in tailored suits stacked folders thick as bricks, their ties neat, their smiles sharp. This wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a battlefield. David sat near the front, hands clasped, heart hammering in his chest. His name was on the list. His story was already known. But today he wasn't just a man with a driveway crack. He was the face of the fight. The chairwoman tapped the mic. We are here to discuss Assembly Bill 421 relating to homeowners, association fines, and enforcement practices. The room buzzed, cameras clicked. Then came the first voice, a lawyer for the HOAs. His tone was polished, practiced. Madam Chair, these so-called horror stories are exaggerations. HOAs are pillars of community order. Without fines, neighborhoods would collapse into chaos. Lawns overgrown, homes in disrepair, property values destroyed. He gestured broadly, his voice dripping with certainty. What Mr. Morales and his supporters fail to understand is that rules protect everyone. Their bill would strip away the very structure that keeps California neighborhoods safe and desirable. A murmur of approval rose from the suit-clad row behind him. David felt his fists tighten. Safe, desirable. Tell that to the woman who lost her house over a mailbox. Tell that to the man fined for a wheelchair ramp. But he stayed silent, for now. Next came the homeowners. A retired veteran, his voice shaking as he described the lien placed on his home for flying a flag the HOA didn't approve of. A young mother, tears spilling as she explained how she was fined daily while her husband was deployed overseas. Each story landed like a blow. Each pause in the chamber felt like a breath held too long. Finally, David's name was called. He rose slowly, his legs heavy but his voice steady. My name is David Morales. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a politician. I'm just a man who fixed his driveway and got fined $2,500 for it. A ripple moved through the room. They say HOAs keep order, but order shouldn't mean fear. It shouldn't mean neighbors spying on neighbors. It shouldn't mean families losing their homes over paint or grass or mailboxes. We trusted these boards to protect us. Instead, they punish us. And now you have the chance to stop it. The silence after his words was heavy, not empty, charged. But the lobbyists weren't done. One rose, smirking. Mr. Morales, isn't it true that you organized unauthorized gatherings in your community? That you've repeatedly refused to comply with your HOA's rules, that your so-called fight is nothing more than personal rebellion dressed up as justice. The words hit like darts, twisted truths, designed not to convince the lawmakers, but to humiliate him. David felt the heat rise in his chest. He wanted to shout. He wanted to slam his fist and call the man a liar. Instead, he breathed, slow, steady. Yes, he said. I gathered my neighbors, because when rules become chains, you have no choice but to stand together, and if that's rebellion, then I'll wear it proudly. The chamber erupted, half in applause, half in outrage. The chairwoman's gavel banged again and again. Order, disorder, the line blurred. But outside those walls, the line was already gone. News crews swarmed the steps. Reporters shoved microphones forward. "Mr. Morales, are you the man trying to dismantle HOAs entirely? Is this about California property values or your personal vendetta?" David pushed past, his wife clutching his arm. They drove home in silence. The phone buzzed nonstop, messages, threats, strangers calling him a hero, others calling him a fraud. By the time they pulled into the driveway, another letter waited on the door. Final notice, failure to comply, lien proceedings initiated. His wife broke down on the porch, her hands covering her face. "David, they're going to take the house. They're really going to do it." For the first time, David couldn't find the words to comfort her. He just held her, staring at the paper taped to their door. The spotlight had grown, the bill was alive, but the price was rising, and it was his family paying first. That night he sat alone in the dark, the glow of the letter burning in his mind. What if the lobbyists were right? What if Sacramento caved? What if all of this, every word, every fight, was just him shouting into the wind? He closed his eyes, fists pressed against his temples. And then he remembered the man across town, barefoot in his driveway, refusing to let the tow truck win. The wife sobbing with gratitude. The neighbors who whispered thank you. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. And if he fell now, others would rise. He whispered into the darkness, not sure if it was prayer or promise. "They can take my house, but they won't take the fight." Because sometimes loss isn't the end. Sometimes it's the spark that burns the walls down. And while David sat in silence, the storm in Sacramento grew louder. The bill was moving faster than anyone expected. But so was the opposition. The next hearing wouldn't just be a battle, it would be war. Everyone thought the law was finished. The governor had signed it, the cameras had flashed, and the headlines had already started calling it a victory for homeowners. But deep in the HOA boardrooms, something else was brewing. Because for years, fines weren't just rules, they were revenue. And the people who built their power on fear and penalties weren't going to let it go without a fight. The first sign came quietly. A notice slipped under a homeowner's door, written in cold legal jargon, reminding them of a mandatory compliance fee. The wording was different. It wasn't called a fine anymore. But it looked, sounded, and smelled like the same punishment in disguise. That night, as neighbors gathered around kitchen tables, whispering over coffee, a question cut through the air. Had the HOAs already found a loophole? Tension spread like a crack in the foundation. People who had celebrated just weeks before now walked their neighborhoods with unease. Lights burned late in home offices as homeowners scrolled through PDFs of new rules, their faces lit blue by laptop screens. One father muttered under his breath, "They're not giving up. They're rebranding the fines." His wife looked at him with tired eyes. "And what happens when we can't afford to fight back this time?" But there was something the HOAs hadn't counted on. The bill hadn't just banned fines, it had ignited something deeper. A movement. All across California, people who had once felt alone, silenced by fear of penalties, ashamed of yard violations, broken by debt notices, were realizing they weren't isolated stories. They were an army. That realization first sparked in a small community outside Sacramento. A retired teacher named Rosa stood up at a neighborhood meeting, her hands shaking as she held a copy of the new law. She read aloud in a voice that quivered but grew stronger with every line. "No association may impose monetary penalties on members for alleged violations of governing documents." The room fell silent. Neighbors glanced at one another, their shoulders lifting as if years of weight had begun to shift. Rosa looked up, her eyes fierce. "They can rename it, they can disguise it, but the law is the law." The next day, someone filmed her speech and uploaded it online. By nightfall, thousands had watched it. By morning, it was a wildfire. Stories poured into the comments. A single mother who had been fined for leaving her trash cans out after working a double shift. A veteran who had racked up penalties for hanging a flag at the wrong angle. A couple who had nearly lost their home over a disputed fence color. And then came the most haunting detail. Almost every one of them thought they had been alone. The HOAs, sensing the ground shifting beneath their feet, doubled down. Lawyers drafted maintenance fees and assessment penalties, hoping the smoke and mirrors would work. But the internet doesn't forget. Screenshots went viral, documents were dissected, and suddenly every attempt at deception became evidence against them. One evening, Rosa received a call from a stranger. His voice was hoarse, tired, but carried a spark of hope. "I saw your video," he said. "I've been fined over 20 times this year. I thought I couldn't fight it, but now maybe I can." Rosa closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt something that had been missing, not fear, not resignation, but resolve. Because this wasn't just about fines anymore. It was about dignity, about neighbors refusing to be treated like tenants in their own homes, about ordinary people finally realizing that together they weren't powerless. And yet, as night fell over California's neighborhoods, a single question lingered like a shadow. What would the HOAs do next, when fear was no longer enough to keep people silent? Everyone thought the storm had passed. The bill was law, the HOAs had been exposed, and neighbors across California were finally breathing again. But just when peace seemed possible, something darker surfaced. Because HOAs didn't just vanish overnight. They regrouped. They adapted. And one by one, they started fighting back, not with fines this time, but with lawsuits. The first came in Los Angeles. A small HOA filed a claim against the state itself, arguing that the new law violated contractual obligations. To most people, it sounded like legal noise, but to the homeowners trapped inside that neighborhood, it was a chilling message. The board wasn't done. They were willing to drag this fight into the courts, using every dollar of community funds to do it. One woman stood on her driveway holding the letter, her hands trembling. "They're suing with my money." "With our money." Word spread like fire. HOAs across the state started testing the waters, disguising penalties as security fees or community contributions. The amounts were small at first, $20 here, $50 there. But everyone knew what it really was, the old system clawing at the walls, desperate to survive. And in the middle of it all, ordinary homeowners faced a choice. Stay quiet, keep their heads down, and hope the boards backed off. Or take the fight further than it had ever gone before. That's when something remarkable happened. A group of neighbors, strangers just months before, gathered in a rented church hall in Fresno. Folding chairs scraped against the floor as people took their seats, clutching copies of notices, violation slips, and legal threats. At the front of the room stood Rosa. Her voice no longer shook. "They think we'll give up," she said, scanning the faces. "They think fear will win again, but this isn't just about one bill. This is about every person who ever cried at their kitchen table over a piece of paper stamped HOA fine." A murmur swept the room, heads nodded. And then slowly hands started to rise, first one, then 5, then nearly the whole hall. People willing to testify, people willing to share their stories publicly, people willing to stand. That night the movement stopped being local. It became statewide. Videos of testimonies poured online. A father whose son's graduation banner had been ripped down, an elderly couple threatened over a dying rose bush, a veteran fined for the ramp he'd built to access his own front door. Their voices cracked, but their words carried the weight of every homeowner who had been silenced. HOAs responded with polished press releases and legal language. They called it necessary governance. They painted themselves as protectors of property values. But the more they spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't about protecting neighborhoods. It was about protecting power. And the public saw it. News crews showed up at community meetings. Lawmakers who had once been silent now stood behind microphones, urging residents to come forward. For the first time in history, the balance was shifting. The ones who had been isolated, shamed, and fined into submission were now united, louder than the boards that had controlled them. But unity came with a cost. Threatening letters multiplied. Some homeowners found themselves targeted more aggressively, singled out as examples. "You think you won?" one notice sneered. "Watch what happens next." Families pulled their blinds tighter, afraid of retaliation. Children asked their parents why people were taking pictures of their houses. Fear was still there, thick, heavy, suffocating. Yet every time fear tightened its grip, resolve answered back. A man in San Diego stood outside his HOA office holding a cardboard sign, "I won't be silenced." Others joined him, one by one, until the sidewalk was lined with neighbors. Cars slowed, people honked, and soon cameras were rolling. And in that moment, something became undeniable. The HOAs could fight, threaten, and sue, but the tide had turned. The silence was broken. The fear was cracked. The law had lit the spark, but it was the people, their voices, their courage, their stories, that turned it into fire. Still in the shadows of boardrooms and law offices, a final question echoed. If lawsuits and threats couldn't stop the movement, what would the HOAs try next? Everyone waited for the hammer to drop. HOAs had tried fines, disguises, and lawsuits. Each time they had failed, but no one believed they would surrender quietly, and they were right. Because one last move remained, the kind meant to scare an entire state back into silence. It began with a letter, thick with legal weight, sent to hundreds of homeowners at once. The language was precise, designed to intimidate. Buried in the lines was a chilling claim. HOAs reserved the right to place liens on homes for unpaid community charges. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't labeled a penalty. But everyone knew what it meant. They were threatening homes again. Fear swept through neighborhoods. People stood at their mailboxes, clutching envelopes, their stomachs tight. Some cried. Others raged. But something had changed since the first battle. This time, fear didn't end in silence. It ended in resolve. The very next day, Rosa stood on the steps of the Capitol, surrounded by neighbors from across California. Cameras clicked, microphones clustered, and her voice carried out over the crowd. "They want to take our homes," she said, steady and fierce. "But we've already taken their power, and now we're taking this fight all the way." Behind her, lawmakers who had once stayed on the sidelines stepped forward. The governor himself appeared, promising not just enforcement of the law, but new protections to shield homeowners from weaponized liens. The crowd roared. For the first time, homeowners felt the system wasn't just watching, it was standing with them. But the most powerful moment came not from the officials, but from the people. A single mother held up the stack of fines that had nearly cost her everything. A veteran raised the notice that had threatened his disability ramp. An elderly couple stood hand in hand, holding the pink slips that once made them ashamed to answer the door. One by one, they dropped them into a metal bin, and when Rosa lit the match, the flames rose high against the evening sky. It wasn't destruction, it was release. Years of fear, shame, and silence burned away in a single fire. Neighbors cried, laughed, and held one another as the papers turned to ash. Because this wasn't just about California anymore. It was about dignity. About proving that no family should live under the thumb of fear in the place they call home. The HOAs still existed. They still held meetings, still managed lawns and pools, but something fundamental had broken. Their power to weaponize fines was gone, stripped away by law and by the voices of the very people they once controlled. And in that quiet shift, something deeper bloomed. Neighborhoods stopped looking over their shoulders and started looking at each other again. People who had once been strangers, neighbors divided by silence, now gathered in driveways, on porches, and in parks. They weren't united by fear anymore. They were united by freedom. As the sun set over California that evening, Rosa walked home under a sky painted gold. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight alone. She smiled, not because the fight had been easy, but because it had been worth it. And as her front door closed, the truth settled into the air like a promise. Sometimes the strongest revolutions don't come from politicians or lawyers. They come from ordinary people, neighbors who refuse to bow, families who refuse to break, voices that refuse to stay silent. Because in the end, the law may have crushed the fines, but it was the people who crushed the fear. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.